In this episode, I shall be talking to Alistair Duncan, and we shall be talking all things NLP, nature awareness, and awareness of your own consciousness. And this, from the view of creativity, is absolutely jam-packed with ideas. So, enjoy. So today's episode, I shall be talking to Alistair Duncan. Hi, Alistair.
Hi.
Nice to see you. Look, I've got a traditional first question, which is, what do you do?
Excellent. What do I do? Well, you a few weeks ago got to encounter what I do. One of the things I do is I take people out into the woods and I get them to do various things, change the way they're using their body and their senses, and then I ask them what happened.
Yes.
That's the very short answer. I'm just super curious in how we relate to ourselves and how we relate to the natural world, and what's actually possible in terms of being a human being. And so I tend to try and create experiences for people that we can then unpack and explore. The same groups, same people may do the same thing and have different experiences, and that I get super curious about that. Being slightly more grounded, I guess I work with loads of different groups, so I do quite a lot of stuff with people who are suffering from mental health issues, because I have found some of the exercises that I do out in the woods with people can have quite a dramatic effect on your autonomic nervous system and your emotional state. So, that's one of the things I do. So I run that. But then I'll do almost exactly the same thing for a workshop that I'm running with Sussex Wildlife Trust. It's called Mindfulness in Nature. But actually the emphasis there is more on the nature connection and the awareness and our relationship with the natural world. And then I might be doing something with, the staff at Sussex University, and it will be similar. We'll be going out in the woods, but the agenda can be different. Could be more around creativity, that sort of thing.
So what I liked about that is that it's quite a simple concept, but it's a massively interesting and very sort of deep possibilities with it, because obviously, as you said already, you can do the same type of thing with different people, and it's a different experience. So when I did that, a lot of things that you said rang bells with me anyway, which
Yeah.
I'm sure will
and I think for me it becomes very, very fascinating. So I've given an illustration about how you can do it with different groups who've got perhaps different, when they first show up, a different priority. But you're absolutely correct, Vic. For me, this can go to some very, very deep places about egoless sense of awareness of being in the world. It can end up with questions about our relationship with nature and how we've got ourselves in the situation we've got ourselves in, not so much at a thinking level, but more at the level, a relational level, rather than a rational thing. So you could rationally say we're all one, we're all part of the same thing, but that's a thinking brain thought.
Yes.
I'm really curious about the felt sense when the boundaries, where your edges end, and actually you're not saying I think we're all one. It's just like, what did I just experience there? It can go into your life narrative about I'm absolutely fascinated in midlife, and I don't think a midlife crisis is a crisis at all. I think it's a moment in our life like adolescence. It happens. How can we navigate that? And particularly, how, for me, can you navigate that? And how can nature help you navigate that? So, yeah.
So there's a word that you said a few times, which I'm going to going to jump on here because
Yeah.
I think this is important. You said fascinated, and
Yes.
that's one of the words that really caught my attention when I learned NLP, because that was one of the things they said at the very beginning about, well, in fact, it was badly said that was one of the things. It was this fascination
Yeah.
about stuff that led to the sort of development of NLP. So I know that that's obviously going to be something we're going to talk about. So
Yeah.
let's sort of go back a little bit. Were you always interested in nature?
It's funny. Yes, I was, and then I wasn't. When I was really young, I don't know. I've thought about it. There were three. I read massively, and I've read massively since I was, since I could read, basically. But I suddenly realised I've always thought there are actually three books that I treasure. One of them is a book nobody will ever heard of, which is called Eyes and No Eyes. And for me personally, there's this wonderful story. It was written by a woman called Arabella Buckley, who I think worked possibly with Darwin, but certainly there was a guy around that time who was travelling to Canada and North America, and she was sort of his assistant and scribe. I can't remember the guy's name. But she wrote this book for children about nature. And it had a lovely story behind it, because it's inscribed, and it was given to my father's uncle for doing well at school, and then he was then killed in the trenches in the First World War, and my dad treasured this book, and then he gave it to me. And it was all eyes and no eyes. That's the title. Is about, when you're in nature, what are you seeing and not seeing? And it was written as a children's book, and it gave me a love of nature from very young age. But another one was, I remember, the Arthur Ransom series.
Yes.
Of those books, that's for 12 volumes, which my godfather basically gave me one for every birthday and Christmas, gave me the whole series. And their outdoor life again sort of informed me.
Yes.
The last one, which possibly in some ways is more, we won't go to it now, but it's Lord of the Rings again, which is deeply rooted in the Nordic relationship, with the world. So those came first, but actually, when I was 10 years old, I used to sleep in, it was last year at junior school, I'd sleep in the back garden every night, right the way through the summer, in a little tent. And I'd make myself a little drink, and then I'd go up into the woods near where I lived in Hove. And they weren't dramatic woods, it was the three-cornered copse, in the Goldstone Valley. And I'd be up there at dawn, sitting under a bush, listening to the birds, probably reliving bits of Arthur Ransom or something like that. So at that period, then, my childhood, every night at dusk, would be down in the garden. I wouldn't be watching telly. Not that there was much telly in those days, but
No.
I'd go and sit down there and just listen to the blackbirds and everything. So I had that, but what was then interesting was that I went off to university, but I then, basically had a born again experience and got into evangelical Christianity and everything. And then I got into, my career was in technology. And so I sort of left it all for quite a long time, and sort of come back to it. And it's become very, very important to me, perhaps in the last 20 years. But I almost had this little period in the middle where this childhood love of just being, sitting out there in nature, went away.
There's so many little themes there that I've already sort of thought, well, what you did with us when we walked out was a little bit like Eyes and No Eyes.
Right. Yeah.
Because it was very much about how, unfortunately, language is going to trip me up here.
Yes.
I can feel this coming on.
Yeah.
But it's like, what are you looking at and what aren't you looking at? And what is it actually that you're seeing? And all of that sort of stuff, all these sort of things that sort of twist around, beginning to sort of be aware of actually how much of what you're seeing is what you're seeing and all the rest of it,
Yeah. Yeah. And that's for me, that's one of the huge. I mean, we won't go there, but there's a huge challenge about language because in some ways, it always makes me laugh. I send people out, and then I ask them a question that is impossible to answer, which is what you just experience.
Yes.
And it's almost sometimes I say it as a joke. It's like I'm going to ask you can you describe a sunset question because you can't describe a sunset in any meaningful way, and actually, so language is a problem. But I think I'm super fascinated in how our experiences are made up on the inside. Yeah. What you are seeing is an internal construction triggered by various waves floating around coming from other objects, but colors, everything like that. I mean, I actually find it quite funny. Everybody talks about the world being a beautiful place, but you could actually be quite brutal and say it's not actually the world that's beautiful. What's beautiful is the way your neurology works to create the images in your head, which is a bit dull, really. It's much better to think of the outside being lovely.
Yeah, exactly. Because again, that's the thing, isn't it, with scientific analysis of something, because everything is rationalized and taken out of context, that it just becomes, I mean, you look at the chemical possibilities of love. I mean, as soon as you go down that route, it's just completely horrible. You have to go through the sort of mythic aspect of the phenomenology of the experience, because we don't really want the science of it, because otherwise nobody would really be in love with one another. Because
and that's right. I think the fascination is to hold the two things together, and I do bring quite a lot of neuroscience as a foundation. Some people might go to myths, or they might go to various places to provide a context for what people are experiencing. For me, I'm quite in, that the advances in neuroscience since the 90s are huge. So I do quite enjoy almost using science as myth or as metaphor.
Yes.
But coming back to your point, I think I'm really, there's almost, we've got two ways of seeing, and that's a really interesting, so it is neuroscience. It's about the left and right hand hemispheres and how they experience something, but all our, as we did in the workshop, all our senses work in two different modes. And you and I the other day talked about Carlos Castaneda, and anybody listening will want to correct me on my words, but basically this sort of shamanic almost way of experiencing the world had two modes: the tonal and the noir. And the tonal was the everyday way you make sense of everything, and the whole thing in Castaneda was Don Juan trying to get Castaneda to experience the world in this other way. And I'm not trying to go down that road, but I am actually trying to give myself and other people some sort of fluency in flipping to these two modes of experience. And you may have come across it in your NLP days, but one of the NLP expressions is actually about stopping the world, which is stolen directly from Castaneda.
Yes.
The way, when I get you to use your peripheral vision for 10 minutes, that is a sort of stopping the world experience, because I've asked you not to label anything or make sense of anything. It's all sense information, but after a few minutes, the way things start to show up for you is quite altered from the normal way of experiencing them. And so I'm super curious at these two different modes of making sense of the world.
The whole sort of, you're saying all of that stuff, I can sort of look at the creative processes that go on within music, whether it's writing a song or playing, or improvisation is a really good example. To try and logically work some of this stuff out is a bit like trying to grasp smoke. You can see it, but you just can't get it. And a lot of those things are often, you can have the map, back to the NLP thing. The map can be your scales or your chords or whatever, but it's not actually where the music is. It's just a way of navigating that sort of terrain that is otherworldly, really. It's all the senses and whatever. And that sort of thing of like being in the groove that musicians talk about is very similar to that peripheral vision thing, where you're in there, but you're not really thinking of anything. It's just you're in that moment.
Yeah. Yeah.
And very interesting things turn up, as you say.
Yeah. Yeah.
The world presents itself to you in another way.
Yeah. Yeah.
Or your experience of the world is represented in another way.
Yeah.
And I found that really, really interesting that you were doing that stuff and explaining it that way, because I really could directly relate to that experience, you know. So when did you said that you had this sort of, shall we call it a diversion for
It was for quite a long time, actually, but it actually wasn't wasted at all, because
I imagine it wouldn't be.
I went on this journey because I converted into evangelical Christianity. You know,
can I ask you about that experience, because I think that is valid. Well, it is valid.
It is valid, yeah, yeah.
Rubbish thing to say. What I meant was, I think that this is going to be as important in your story as a lot of the other things.
Yeah,
I'm guessing here.
And I think you're right. You're absolutely right for a number of different reasons. I think one thing, I mean, you know, people like to say, oh, religion's created all the problems in the world and everything like that, and to some degree, yes, that's true. But in something like the figure of Jesus, which, you know, they're another faith as well, there is almost like a calling
Yes.
to live a life that is not about you exclusively, and that bit of it certainly, I think, deeply informs me. Most people go out and run a business, and then they might do something that's like helping disadvantaged, or is like pro bono or something like that. And actually, when I left the corporate world, which I was in for many years, I actually spent nearly all my time doing stuff, you know, working in some of the most disadvantaged places in Brighton. And then occasionally I did stuff at Sussex University or something like that to earn a bit of money. But I almost, and that came from my period in Christianity. But almost what became more important is it led to a lot of studying. I went on, and there were two reasons why I did this, but I did a master's in, I like to say it was a master's in philosophy, but really it was phenomenology. I was interested.
Oh, right. Okay.
It was all about, you know, how, you know, Husserl and Heidegger and Merleau-Ponty and what have you. It's all about how the world shows up for us. So I was fascinated by that, but I was also looking for an escape. What people would call it is an escape from metaphysics. And by metaphysics can mean several things, but I mean it in the sense, and Plato's almost like the beginning of metaphysics, because, you know, he comes along and says there are the forms, there are the ideals that are actually behind what is, and so you've created this second layer. And then you go all the way through to Nietzsche, who says, you know, God is dead, or you know, fundamentally Nietzsche was the collapsing of that metaphysics and saying, actually, there just is what there is, which is how I feel it is. It's just actually what is rich with many dimensions of experience in them. You don't need a story above to explain it. So I think in my retreat from Christianity, which obviously has this upper layer where, you know, there's God, who's outside of what is, and he creates what is, in my desire to escape that philosophically, it led me into very rich pastures. So I am fascinated in what I'm doing from a, you know, scientific point of view, from a philosophical point of view, from a psychological point of view. You know, for me, all of those play into.
Because I think when you have a conversion experience, I wouldn't say that I've had one, so I'm not talking.
And I did have, I can remember it vividly.
Yes, yes. But I think you know, there are moments of becoming that people experience in life, which maybe people can associate with even if they haven't had a conversion experience. So do you know what? See where I'm?
Yeah, I do. What was funny is that my conversion experience was in some ways fitted very well with actually where I went. I remember it was an evening I went to Durham University, and I was up there. And so my point of conversion, if you like, was actually to go out and say to the sky or the world, basically acknowledgement that there was someone greater. And it was almost like, I give up, you take over, sort of thing. It was the ideas about sin and falling short and everything like that sort of came along later. I learned that was part of the package. But there was a moment of almost like surrender to a transcendent being. And the only natural thing to do as a human being was to give yourself, you're almost back to your love thing in a way. It's almost a love response in a way.
Yes, it is.
And that, but interestingly for me, it was at dusk, out on a terrace overlooking the River Wear and Durham Cathedral.
That's an amazing experience. That place is incredible.
Yeah, no, it is wonderful.
And again, that's because I'm always interested in context.
Yeah.
When you have an experience like that, and the context was that you were looking at one of the most amazing representations of Christianity from a long time ago, really.
Yeah. And there was another context for me personally, because I think I have always been, my questions changed, or at a deeper level, the questions have always been the same. But, the sort of, what is the point of, is there meaning? So I think, when I was at school, I was into Taoism, and then I went to university and did transcendental meditation, and then I fell into Christianity.
Well, that's an interesting point, because often I've often thought of people going the other way.
Well, I've come back to Taoism. I personally now I think Taoism is the most coherent of the ancient explanations. I
tend to agree with you.
Yeah. So no, I've definitely come back. I've come full circle in that regard.
Because again, a lot of that is about things being there's sort of a rootedness about things. I mean, somebody said to me, the Chinese are incredibly practical, right? Incredibly practical in their way of doing. And Taoism's sort of like that, because it's got all this sort of cosmology, but it's always like there's a sort of a grounded and rootedness about things, in the way that you're part of this heaven and earth thing, you're rooted in the earth.
Yeah.
You can't just be in the air type of thing,
Yeah. I think the other thing is that I think for me it resonates really strongly with what I'm aspiring to do, and you find these parallel models all the way across the world. So you've got Taoism, but again, in the Anglo-Saxon Nordic thing, you had the weird, and certainly through the eyes of Brian Bates and his Way of Weird book, he's portraying it. I'm always slightly suspicious about this, because Brian Bates, who wrote this book called The Way of Weird, which is a lovely book, was actually quite good friends with Alan Watts, who was the guy in California who was responsible for introducing, So I've always wondered whether Brian Bates did a bit of a wash on weird and turned it.
Possibly. Yeah, I mean, if you're friends with Alan Watts, it was going to say something different.
But anyway, that notion of weird is the same. It's almost like this invisible web that you're the idea behind in Taoism at one level is you move in. How do you move? How do you do without doing? Because you're moving in the flow of what is. The weird is the same. There's another phrase which I love. The Navajo have an expression of hozo, and it's got that same idea of walking in beauty. This is the phrase, but when you unpack it, it's this multi-dimensional world which includes this flow relationship with the natural world and other people, and I'm fascinated that there are these traces all over the world of this way of being that doesn't strive, that moves at ease in things.
Just a moment. The cat has announced that it wants to leave the room. Thank you. Sorry about that. it's just occasionally the cat wants to join. It was asleep and now it's decided it wants to leave.
Yeah.
I like the thing you're saying about flow.
Yeah. And where I was going to go again, we crammed a lot into that hour and a half that we had in the woods at the World Weekend, or into the World Festival. But one of the things I think we did quite at the end was that thing of, can you walk? So I guess for listeners, so basically, I've gone through an exercise where centering and grounding, one of my arguments is you can't really experience anything if you've got any noise in your system, which again, I sort of got off NLP once upon a time. But having done that, I then invite people to walk in a different way. So you're landing on the front of your feet. You're using peripheral vision. So you're not focused, you're using all your rods that are splayed out across the back of your eyes, which run through your neurology differently, then playing around with listening in the same way. And then I asked everybody to go back out to the woods again, but I'd ask them, can you hear the silence at the heart of everything, the still silence at the heart of everything? And then there was an invitation to move in that without causing a ripple in that. You're pushing towards an experiential Taoism at one level. It's actually, what is it like to move through these woods in such a way that I'm in flow,
yes,
internally and externally at the same time.
That was a really powerful exercise. And because there's a few sort of Taoist things, isn't there? The master that can walk through the village and changes everything in the village, even though people don't know that he's walking through the village, type of thing. It's that sort of the way that the world, and there's lots of representations of this, like goddesses that walk, and as in their footsteps flowers grow. I mean, there's lots of symbology about how our presence in the world can transform things in such a way that it doesn't actually require any sort of doing.
No. Have you ever heard, there's a story Carl Jung apparently is his favourite story to tell, and every time he had dinner, even when he had dinner with the same people time and time again, he told this story about the Rainmaker. Have you ever heard that?
No, I'm not sure I do know this one.
Okay, so basically there was a guy, Richard Wilhelm, who I think was a missionary to China a long time ago, but he also was the first guy to translate the I Ching.
Yes,
that's him. He overlapped with Jung, and Jung knew him. And apparently, while Richard Wilhelm was out, doing whatever he was doing, there was a drought in this place. And the way Jung tells the story is, the Christians all prayed madly, the Buddhists waved their flags, everybody brought their best trick to the party, but the rain didn't come. And so they sent for this old man from another village, and he came, and they said, well, what do you need? He said, I just need a hut. And he went and sat in the hut for 4 days. And then he came out and it started snowing. And arguably, because this is from Wilhelm, maybe it's historical, I don't know. But the whole point, and they said, and Wilhelm went to him and said, well, what did you do? How did you make it rain? He said, I didn't make it rain. Where I came from was in the Tao. I came here, this place was out of the Tao. So I went out of the Tao. So I needed to get myself back. And when I was back in the Tao, it started raining, but it was nothing to do with me. And it's just, I love it.
It's awesome.
I've got a shepherd's heart, which I not in any belief that I am a rainmaker at all, but almost as a reminder to myself, I call it the rainmaker's heart, because when I go off and hide there. But I just love that thing. It's about, almost like you're saying, by doing nothing, and you get yourself in right relationship internally and externally, then the world organizes itself. You're not actually manipulating it. It's just things show up in a different way.
Yes, I think that's brilliant, because I have actually heard that story, but it wasn't until you started to tell it that I remembered it. But again, with sort of songwriting is a good example here. You always have people trying to do trying to write a verse, trying to do, and it's almost like, well, no, don't do that. So this just, use like a sort of cut up technique or something like that, which is completely random and completely bonkers. And then you just do these things and just, there it is.
There it is.
Yeah.
I remember. Sorry, I was a great fan of you too, and I remember seeing a interview with The Edge, and actually he said, you just have to go. You can't make it happen. You just have to keep doing something, and then it shows up. That's not exactly word for word, but it was that sort of idea. Yeah. I can't make this thing happen, but I have to do something in order for the thing to actually show up.
Because I often quote Keith Richards' thing about the songs. They're already out. They're already out there. You just have to get your guitar and hook them in. Yeah. It's like it's that sort of thing of, it's not you, but you're part of the process.
Yeah.
Part of the alchemy. Yeah. But it's not you. And it's almost like, it's either a courtship or it's an alchemy, or you're a portal conduit, whatever. Lots of different things. But as soon as you start to intellectualize,
you're doomed. You're doomed.
So you're interested in NLP then, Alistair. How did that develop?
It developed. It came from me. It amuses me now. I worked for American Express for about 20 years, and I was basically doing technology, which is not terribly relevant to this. But I increasingly got involved in doing training, and it was really funny because we ran this big training program, but the people who were running it were totally anti-NLP, and NLP shall not be mentioned. Okay. Then I moved to IBM, and near the end of my time there, I was running a training program, and some people from outside came in to help us develop this communications masterclass, and they were deeply steeped in NLP. And so, I just got fascinated, and we ran this course, and it was one of the best things I ever did in my life, and the feedback was just outstanding. People were absolutely loving it. And I wanted to get out of the corporate world anyway, so I got out of it. But on the back of having had this experience of these people who were just able to work with people in such a transformative way very quickly, I was hooked. So I immediately, with some of my redundancy money, went on the full NLP training journey. And what I think was hugely significant, I always think of NLP as like a martial art. Who you train with is everything. There are so many different ways it can be done. Some I really, really, really uncomfortable with, and some are beautiful and elegant. And it all comes from, who you sat under, almost, who you learned from.
That's a brilliant description, actually. It really is a brilliant description. I think because we got the Bandler Grinders.
Yeah.
Thing, right? I always like Bandler's approach, and it was just, it's there. If you want to, you could read the book type of thing. Just get on with it. Yeah. Whereas there were other approaches which were really, almost scientific about this is, it's a internal kinesthetic, and so and so. And you could write it out as a formula. And to me, I found that it just didn't resonate with me. But for some people, they loved it.
Yeah. I mean, it makes me laugh. If I go back to my church thing, NLP is almost like the Christian church, really. Once upon a time, you had one church, then you Orthodox and Catholics split, and then the Church of England split from the Catholics, and then the Methodists split from the Anglicans, and NLP's been a bit like that. So you're right. There was the initial split, and in fact so I've never gone anywhere near Bandler. I have, I don't have him in high regard. I know, but I'm not right or wrong. It's just the path I learned down the Grinder thing. But what particularly is important to this conversation is I learned with a woman called Judith Delosier, who had trained with John Grinder in the early days. But almost more importantly, she had become very good friends with a woman called Judith Delosier, who was John Grinder's wife in, if you like, the second phase of NLP. And for me, in terms of what we're talking about today, that became absolutely crucial, because they were living on the same piece of land as a English scientist called Gregory Bateson, who really
Yes.
is a bit of a legend.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So he went into the mix, but they were also deeply influenced by Carlos Castaneda, and they ran this workshop, which I have the book of. I even to people who are into NLP, I'm not sure I recommend it. It's hard work, but it was this 5-day workshop that is basically littered with Bateson, Castaneda techniques, and there had been a book written then, quite a famous book now, by Colin Turnbull, called The Forest People, about these forest-dwelling pygmies in the Congo.
Right.
And for me, that phase of NLP was really rooted in almost like our relationship with the world, and that was almost they had an agenda about, say, wisdom can only come by being in relationship with, something systemic.
Yes.
They were drawing on all of Bateson's systemic things and, multiple descriptions, that there's no one simple explanation. You need multiple explanations of the same thing in order to fill the pattern out. They were using, stop the world, which is a Castaneda idea of know-nothing states and everything like that. But also more than that, Judy Lozier was both an anthropologist but also a dancer. And so what she brought into NLP big time was about the wisdom of the body and what she calls somatic syntax and everything like that. So I grew up in that world, a world that took me back, gave me a tool set almost for engaging with nature and a methodology from it, but coming, with rich in anthropology and the body and everything like that, which you may not get if you do a normal NLP practitioner, master practitioner.
The thing was, the Bandler thing obviously was a different experience, but there were a lot of similarities to what you're saying there, where you listened deeply to what he was saying. You got where the stuff was coming from, but you had to listen, because it was all these sort of nested loops within the stories where you'd go, it's talking about this quite a bit, it's talking about things about mental illness and how you could see patterns of behavior that somebody who was psychotic, that you just think, oh, well, they're not well, was actually told you a lot about how the mind worked, how your relationship with the world is not, when you see it in somebody like that, you think, oh, they're just ill, but they're experiencing that. They're experiencing that situation.
Their reality,
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
So there were lots of things like this, and often, the odd reference to things you sort of, because I would listen to and think that's sort of martial arts stuff, but it wouldn't be just like moving chi around, but that's what he was talking about. And, and then you've got this sort of thing, you think, well, that's sort of a shamanic thing coming in here. But it was that thing you had to listen. But he was, I mean,
it is fascinating the different way, and the other, because they were all very deeply influenced by another fascinating guy, Milton Erickson, who was and I think the two streams used it in different ways. But there's a guy, Steve Gilligan, who was part of that set, and I think he was 19 years old, and he just spent every day he could with Milton Erickson until he died. But he has now birthed this thing, which again I've trained in, called Generative Coaching. So it's almost working at a trance level, unconscious level, but then working with them all together. I mean, that's another big thing I got from NLP, which I think plays into what I do in the woods, is the idea of three minds. So you've got the cognitive mind, the logical meaning-making part, which I would associate with the left-hand hemisphere. Then you've got the somatic mind, which is, what's going on in the body and senses and everything like that, and, unconscious, whatever that means. But then you've got the field mind, which is what's going on between and in between the field that you're in, whether that's a social field or it's out in the woods or whatever like that. So again, that's given me a model that I don't necessarily tend to articulate in a work. No. Fundamentally, what's going on in my head is, when you're going out there, you are moving into field mind, which is accessible through your body, through your somatic mind, and then you can make sense and talk about it with your cognitive mind and map it.
Yeah, that's really interesting because, again, taking that reference to sort of music, I said about context, which is, again, like you're saying about field.
Yeah.
Again, you're working with different musicians.
Yeah.
It makes you different.
Yeah. And it's like the jazz scenario, I guess, isn't it?
Totally.
In improvised jazz, all of those levels are going on,
Yes.
but the whole is much, much bigger than the...
That's right. And it changes the way that you are as a player.
Yeah.
And, I've toyed around with this quite a lot within the work that I do, where I'll work with really sort of top pro players.
Yeah.
And an amateur or a teenage, who just is in that mix. They might have written this riff, and they may not be particularly technically that good.
Yeah.
But I often thought about like the old blues players and the sort of roots players, reggae musicians and all the rest of it, who technically they weren't anything special.
Oh,
but they as soon as they played, the world changed.
Yeah.
And you can get that when you get an idea that comes in and puts you on the back foot.
Yeah.
So you automatically have a problem with your intellectual habitual thinking.
Yeah.
So, and again, going back to that experience that you do when you're walking in the woods, that's that type of thing that you're out of a habit. It takes you out of your habitual patterning where you're just walking.
Doing
what you normally do.
Yeah.
Go on. So I'm totally fascinated by that. So, okay, go back to the NLP thing then. So, because you mentioned a couple of things, and you said about the fact that there was in that period of time where there was a reference to Castaneda, which is sort of seems to have disappeared somewhat.
I think just because it got so complicated, there was a double thing how much of it was true, which I'm personally completely uninterested in. Something doesn't have to be true to be useful. But also there was almost like a cultish element, and people died, and it was all a bit. It wasn't quite Jonestown, but there were potentially some complications.
Yeah, so no, that's probably why.
But I feel, you go and read Journey to Ixtlan. I still think it's one of the better book I go back to every few years. Yes. I have listed exercises straight out of it. For me, it's super important.
Yes, yeah. I think again, you are dealing with Castaneda's thing. Because however true or whatever, doesn't mean to say that it's not real.
No.
Because the experiences that can be generated from those are very real,
Yeah.
And of course, you're dealing with either something that's directly shamanic or by extension is connected to something shamanic. And obviously, any initiation in shamanism could be deadly.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's not a cozy, let's all
exactly
go on the weekend shamanic retreat and all go on a ritual. It's not, there's no health and safety.
No, exactly. Yeah. I mean, the other thing I found interesting, because I listened to a few of your podcasts, and you had the conversation with Thomas Storkhorn. Is that his name?
It's Thomas Chopin. Yeah.
Chopin, which I found fascinating because I only met him for the first time, a couple of weeks ago, actually. But I've been aware of him because he really was, from what I can tell, the guy who brought the Tom Brown, John Young Nature Awareness connection to England.
Yes.
What actually happened for me was that there was somebody else who he had worked with him, he trained with him, who then set out on his own. And it was that guy, a guy called Rob Fallon, who I actually... I learned, so most of the things we did out in the woods, Thomas would be doing as well. Yes. But I brought my NLP to it. So I basically said, I'm not really interested in tracking animals or that sort of thing. I've just experienced some stuff that was really interesting when Rob taught me how to track and taught me how to do various things. There's the whole thing in NLP about modeling, which is basically you work out how something's happening. So really what I've done is I've modeled these things that lots of other people are teaching, but I've then taken them into a different space. Now, in actual fact, when I listen to Thomas, I'm not taking to that different space. The conversation you had with him, he may use slightly different language to me, but he's wanting to take people into a very, very similar, deep connection with nature, but also a deeper awareness of their own selves and their own way of being. And he and I might use slightly different language, but we're talking about the same thing. It's just I've sort of NLP and neuroscienced it, and he's held it close to the land with his traditions, and both are great.
Yes, well, again, they're just different maps to a similar territory.
Different maps, yeah.
So what again, for me, because I'm NLPing, when I listen to, when I have conversations with people, there are certain things that come up. Every episode, there is something I take away. And sometimes the most unexpected. And because people's, it's a bit like that, the Hindu story of the four blind people and the elephant, the description of the elephant.
Yes.
Everybody's got their own description of this thing, their concept of reality. And everyone is right, but they can be completely different. And it's interesting listening to people talk about something that I can recognize as what's going on. Let's call it the right side of the brain. Terrible, but let's just call it that for the moment. That the sort of thing where there's a completeness of viewpoint instead of that being this is this over here. When you're getting a much more inclusive viewpoint, and then it helps me to colour in certain things in a way that I'm not necessarily done that way before. And again, sometimes I do that by embodying a way of people thinking. So I'll give you an example of this. There's a guy that I interviewed called Dr. Alexander Cummings.
Right.
Now this guy writes and edits books on magic, like medieval magical manuscripts and stuff like that. And he is incredibly well versed in all sorts of traditions, from hoodoo and so he's an incredible character. He's got this incredible workload that he manages to produce. And as soon as you get people who can do that stuff, who are writing these extraordinary tomes on stuff that's, in some of the language is almost impenetrable, You think there must be a system. There's a way that they do that. And he said something very interesting to me. He said, I've got a bit of a butterfly mind. And I thought, well, so have I. He says, so what I tend to do is I sort of think, well, I'm not actually going to be doing any writing today, but I shall just open my book up and just leave it there, just in case I get an idea. And you can see that it's almost like some sort of conjuration, right?
Yeah.
And I'll just put a notepad over there and a reference book over here. Only, I'm not actually going to do anything. And then obviously,
and then it gets going. Yeah.
And I've used that simple idea.
Yeah.
And it's been amazing.
Yeah.
And what it is, I suppose, in a way, it's like because you're playing a game with and he called it sleight. What I liked about it, he called it sleight of mind. And I thought, well, that's like sleight of mouth or whatever it was.
Yeah, sleight of mouth in NLP, isn't it?
Yeah. Dilts, rocks,
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. So I see things like that, and I go, I'm not sure which way this came. Whether this was something he might have picked up from Robert Dilts's book or something. He didn't say that, but he could have been. and then took that and changed it a little bit and applied it to something else. And so your courses and the stuff that you do, because I this is a plug for you. I highly recommend that people should come on your courses because they're amazing. Even just that.
Even that taster.
Even that taster was brilliant. And a lot of people who went on it, you could see they were completely in it. So how do what sort of things have you got going, first of all?
What I think, well, I'm sort of coming a bit toward the end of the year in a way. I guess it works. I've sort of got 3 levels, and so basically, I actually nick it off the Tom Brown guys, but I've almost got the core routines, which are things like that. They're just entry points, but they can go on. There's lots more, working with blindfolds, other things which are sort of stolen from NLP. But you talk about perceptual positions, putting it or modeling, but I get people to become different things and stuff like that, but to discover what you pick up in your system. So there's a whole range of things there. I mean, one thing I'm going to start running next year, which I wanted to do for a long time, is to run a 6-month course that starts there and then explores a lot more. But I'm really interested in the idea of mind at a really experiential level. Some of that, Bateson wrote this fabulous book. Well, it's not most. The idea in it is a superb. Let's put it that way. Called "Mind and Nature: A Necessary Unity." And one of his phrases, which I put on my website, is most of the problems in the world are caused between the difference between how humans think and the world is. And so our cognitive mapping mind is, you could argue that most of our problems in the universe, or whether it's environmental or whatever it is caused by our neocortex, our ability to imagine something that isn't there, and then the strength of will to be able to make it a reality. But that's not wise. That bit of the brain is not wise, because it has to reduce everything.
Yes.
Whereas the other way experiences everything.
Yes.
So
that's brilliantly put.
Yeah. So I'm really cute. So in the longer course, that will embase, really, there's some theory, but also a lot of it is about how can I, what's it like, to experience mind, wholeness, all those sorts of things. Yeah. Some of it is around transpersonal, the journey we make in life, exploring practically the idea of Tao or weird or Hozo and stuff like that, but it all comes out of this core experiential thing. And then I do stuff, as I say, for people with mental health issues, and it's interesting. I've just stopped. I used to run life coaching courses and stuff that's more psychologically. Or, I used to run something. I had a terrible title, but it used to attract people. But, it's called The Real Me. But fundamentally, exploring almost away from spirituality about how our ego and how our logical mind causes us so much misery, and how if we can change our relationship with ourselves, we can then actually, our relationships can be different. Our sense of purpose. I mean, nearly everybody who runs a life coaching course, you start off with objectives. What are you trying to achieve? Who do you want to be? And I did that for some years, and I just thought I don't think this is right, because actually most of the things you try and achieve in life are to try and make yourself feel something, to feel okay. How many stories do you hear about, the hugely successful businessman, the Bill Gates or somebody like that, who basically was trying to prove to his dad that he was okay. So we're often, the goals we set ourselves, or the things we want to try and achieve, are driven by a desire to try and make ourselves feel okay. It's much better to start the other way around and live from a place of feeling okay, and then make your choices. Going back to the Taoism, it's a longer term, but there's a Taoist phrase, in the morning you say, there is nothing to do today. I have nothing I need to do today. What shall I do? It's a bit like your guy's little trick with his singing away.
It is.
Yeah,
It is.
do that at a
Absolutely.
life level, and it's not for everybody. I think that's why I think the midlife thing is super interesting for me. So again, I've run workshops for people for midlife. But what I'm doing at the moment is I'm wanting a lot of those used to happen indoors, and I'm wanting to. It's like David Abraham, who we've not touched upon, who is a great influence.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. David.
About you cannot be human without being in relationship and conviviality with what is more than human. And if you take the path of psychology started off with the single person, then it moves to relationships, then you get to sort of family constellations, then you get business psychology. There's the whole field of ecopsychology, which says it's impossible to consider or explore what it means to be human, torn out of what we are actually, which is nature. So I'm really interested in taking a lot of things that I've been doing, in the classroom or in the lecture room, and taking them out and embedding them to nature. And I've almost had a break because of the pandemic, but what I'm going to be rolling out next year is things that are in those sorts of territories.
It sounds really interesting. Here's a question. You're talking about working with people who are mentally ill.
Yeah.
What have you discovered about yourself or human consciousness from working with people, like we were saying earlier on, who are ill, but they show you something that is you would never have seen.
Yeah. I think my response to that is interesting. And again, it comes back to another NLP presupposition. Nobody's broken. Nobody needs fixing. Nobody needs to do anything to be okay. You are okay. And we're all running stuff.
Yes.
We just run it in different ways. So I kind of never, everything's just a continuum anyway. We're all, we make our own experience. We use the outside world as our raw material. And then we trigger ourselves with it. Yeah. So anxiety is essentially what you're doing. And what you're then doing is you're using a neurology that was designed. So if you're stressed, when I'm feeling cantankerous, I say there's no such thing as, there's no stressful situations. There's nothing stressful outside of me. Stress is just a label for a certain autonomic state that we call fight or flight, yes. Where we've gone into a certain thing, and I mentioned Steve Gilligan. He calls it neuromuscular lock. I love that expression. It's a tightening up in order to defend ourselves. So the question just becomes, how am I creating in that in myself? And I can do that. Somebody might come along to me with anxiety. Or depression or whatever it is. But the fascinating thing for me is, one, to teach them or bring them to a place where they can find a place of being centered, grounded, aware, open and not locked in as a starting point. And from that place, then they can start to explore, how am I creating my own experience here? Now and I do that just as much as somebody who might have a label.
Yes.
And they may be experiencing far more, and there may be some deeper things going on. I'm completely open to that. But at a starting point, I always tend to say there may be some very deep things that you might need to get to one day, but there's a whole bunch of surface stuff that is relatively easy to sort out. Yes. So it's almost like clearing the decks, that just by learning how you run your autonomic nervous system, you get a huge step forward if you can understand how you're using thinking to make yourself feel certain ways, meaning making. It's back to the map is the territory. All you're doing the whole time is making maps of what you think's going on out there. To illustrate it, I often give the illustration that you could have two people who behave towards you in exactly the same way. One who's probably your partner, you trigger yourself with a strong emotional reaction. The other one you don't. So it's not actually what they're doing that's causing it. It's what you're running on the inside. And I'm the same. To answer your question, what do I learn about myself? I learn that across a large spectrum, we're all doing the same thing, just to different degrees.
Yes, that's pretty. You said something really fascinating actually about clearing the decks, because there's something about that expression which is really, really interesting, because that term actually comes from the Navy. Clearing, clearing the decks before action. So before they went, let's say Nelson's time, before they went into action, they literally cleared everything off the deck. Everything that could move around was chained down or whatever, or put away, and they were ready for action. Now, there is something about, I met somebody who was a psychiatric nurse many years ago, who came out with this term called, and they called it schizophrenic dirt, which was the clutter that you find in somebody who's suffering from some condition, let's call it that for a minute. And their life was chaos, but their environment was chaos. If you went into their house, it was chaos.
Yeah.
And you was talking about that surface level of stuff. It almost taps into all this stuff of, space clearing and all that. But that idea that what goes on in here is reflected out in your surroundings, as well as it coming in the other way. I've always found that intriguing. And that what you're saying about clearing the decks, I think is really fascinating.
Although I might pick you up on your description, because I'd like to suggest to you there is nothing going in or out.
Probably not.
There is nothing. You've got this thing called skin. Okay,
yes.
Nothing other than physical violence, which is a completely different section. But anything else that's going on in relationships or anything like that, nothing's getting in your way. It's the old adage, it's not mine. Nobody can annoy you, nobody can upset you. How could anybody actually upset you? What are they going to do? They're going to crawl in through your ear, get into your brain and twist a few circuits. It's actually physically impossible for anybody to affect you. What you're doing it yourself. You're observing something. Nothing's getting in you. You're then running something to make yourself feel a certain way. And for me, that's the huge get out of jail thing, is when you realize that you are creating your own experience. And that works all the way down. If you're out in the woods, you're not actually seeing anything. The light doesn't get into your head. It gets turned into electrical impulses. It travels to several parts of your brain and work together to create this image. So what you're seeing is not what your brain is creating. What you're emoting is what you are creating. And for me, that's a really fundamental principle. That if we can notice that we're creating our own reality and our own experience, that is the starting point to having a more enjoyable or more successful life.
Which brings me to a point that I said when we were on that thing, and you sort of stopped me in my tracks.
Okay.
When I was talking about the idea that people had about vision, that instead of coming in, it was going out. In other words, you apprehended the thing. It was like something came out of your eye and apprehended what it was that you were seeing. It wasn't coming in. And although you sort of go, well, you could, from a scientific point of view, you could go, well, but the concept of, it's not, your irritation isn't that thing coming in and messing around with your brain. It's how you apprehend that thing and make it. And I think there's something.
Or I think particularly it's the meaning you're making of it.
Yes.
But I think there's another side in terms of what you're saying about what's actually happening physically. I think this is why it's always super interesting to do the science. But what becomes like something interesting there are so many ways of seeing. So yes, in the workshop we played around peripheral, but actually it's a really interesting thing to do, is to say, we can have a penetrating gaze.
Yes.
Or we can have a receiving gaze, and it's super interesting to play around with those two and say, when you're wide, you are fundamentally in a receiving mode. Focused vision tends to be a penetrating.
Yes, which is, even if like that idea from a medieval, well, it's not even medieval, it's even older than that, this idea of the thing going out from your eye. Because that obviously leads to all sorts of things like the evil eye and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
But from a mythos point of view, that makes absolute sense, that the penetrating gaze, that idea that you can fix somebody's gaze and everything, from that point of view, is a really interesting thing to sort of play with.
No, absolutely. And you can do it with all, the poem that I touch on has that lovely thing about, your hands, these upturned feet, are for grasping and shaping.
Yes.
Hold them, take them out of the way, or possibly even better, make them go soft again. Yes. And sometimes I'll do that. I'll play around actually with touch, and I'll steal stuff from Tantra or wherever to say, actually, can I shift the way I'm experiencing through my hands so they're becoming receptors, rather, so that because actually it's a bit like with the sight, but with touch, we've lost. There's a lovely expression about how the difference between sensitivity and sensation. What we tend to do in our modern world, in order to continue to experience, we increase sensation. Music gets louder and faster and more insistent. Color, if you look at some TV program, when they do a remake, and nowadays, if you watch these crime programs, which I absolutely hate, but we need an excitement every few seconds or we won't keep watching. That's our addiction to sensation. If you go the other way, it's how can I increase sensitivity? I actually need less and less and less and less to become more and more aware. And again, I guess that's what I'm trying to do in the woods as well, is go in the direction of sensitivity rather than increasing sensation.
Yeah, that's good, because that explains really well deodorants.
Yeah.
Because nowadays you can walk down the street and you can be basically knocked out by somebody's deodorant. It's just shocking. If you've got a decent sense of smell, it can be completely eliminated by somebody. Anyway, that's a interesting point. Well, Alistair, that was brilliant, fantastic. I'll put stuff on the show notes so that if people are interested in what you're doing, and I really recommend that they find out what you're doing.
Come on. And hopefully they'll have a better idea, because one of the great challenges I have in life is to actually explain what on earth you're going to be doing. It's so experiential that it's like, what's the point? If you go foraging, if you sign up for a foraging course or a basket making course or a survival course, you sort of know you're going to get something, but actually all you're really getting with me is some tools and experiences to navigate the landscape. You're in a landscape, and the landscape that you're in interesting and hopefully useful ways.
Well, I understand that one, because I run a music summer school every year. It was every year, but we had a couple of years off, but we ran it this year, and we have the same problem, because people do like things that they don't realize that they can do.
Yeah.
But you can't tell them that that's what they're going to do.
No.
So they're going to be able to achieve all these things, and they just have to turn up and do it. But I think what you're doing is really transformational. For people, they realise that there's this other thing, another way of seeing the world, and even in a little taster thing like that, you realise. And this is obviously coming from somebody who does NLP. And you realise, But it's really good stuff. Cool. So thanks ever so much for your time.
Well, thank you.
And all the best for what you're doing.
Thanks a lot, Vic. Brilliant.
Speak to you soon.
Yep. Bye.